So, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this session, Enhancing Young People's Reading Enjoyment and Engagement with Books. I'm Becky, I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to be hosting this afternoon's session. A quick word about the EA. We are a learned society and subject association that was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through to secondary and further education, to higher education and beyond, and we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers, so thank you very much to Sarah and Heather for joining us this afternoon, and I will introduce you properly in a moment. Our members make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. Membership starts at just £29 for an entire year and enables you to support our events and campaigning work, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to properly introduce our speakers. So Professor Sarah McEwen is joining us from the Literacy Lab at the University of Edinburgh, and Sarah's research focuses on understanding and improving literacy experiences and outcomes across the lifespan and enriching lives through literacy. We're also joined by Heather Collins, who is the School Communities Manager for Engagement at the Scottish Book Trust. We will send you all kinds of juicy follow-up stuff after the session along with the recording, so you can find out more about Heather and Sarah. Okay, Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you to get started, and I will just pull up your slides.
Thank you, Becky. I'll just wait for the slides to come up. Perfect. Thank you very much. I don't feel we need to introduce ourselves now because Becky's done such a great job. But Heather is joining me today from the Scottish Book Trust, and today we're going to be focusing on teenagers' reading enjoyment and engagement and sharing some of the research that we've been carrying out over the last few years, which has focused on this. Next slide, please. So I thought it might be useful, first of all, to reflect on where we are in terms of the UK context. You might not be able to see this graph particularly well, but this is data taken from the National Literacy Trust, which has been tracking 2 decades of children and young people's reading enjoyment and engagement. And what we've seen from at least the last decade, from about 2016 onwards, is quite continued declines in terms of the number of children and young people who say they enjoy reading, in addition to those who say that they read regularly. And next slide, please. Just splitting this data out into a little bit more detail. This is the same data, but splitting it by boys, girls, based on different age ranges as well, and looking at the children who have and do not have free school meals. Sorry, next 2 slides, Becky. Thank you. What we can see is if we look at the patterns of reading enjoyment and engagement, they're not the same for children and for young people. So if we compare, for example, data from 2005 to data from 2025, what we see is a decline in percentage points of about 20% of children aged 8 to 11 saying that they enjoy reading. And again, quite steep declines as well in the number of early adolescents as well, aged 11 to 14, we see a 14% drop. But in terms of teenagers, what we see is actually the decline in reading hasn't really been evident over the last couple of decades. What's been the case is that teenagers have historically not said that they enjoy reading and continue to say that they don't enjoy reading. And so when we talk about the declines in reading enjoyment and engagement, really the declines refer to children, but that doesn't make teenagers not being a kind of cause for concern. It's just that historically they've tended to report lower levels of enjoyment and engagement. Next slide, please. And I think this can lead us to ask questions as to what is reading? What does it mean to be a reader as well? And back in 2017, I carried out a research project in collaboration with the Scottish Book Trust called Growing Up a Reader. And this was a project which we carried out alongside children and young people to find out their perceptions of a reader and also motivators and barriers to reading. And in terms of some of the common themes that we found from both children and young people, they said that readers were people who enjoyed reading, who read frequently, who chose to read of their own volition, who were skilled at reading, and who primarily read print books. But young people, that is the teenagers, were also more likely to say that readers could read a wider range of materials and didn't necessarily need to read as frequently in order to be described as a reader. Next slide, please. In terms of the Growing Up a Reader project, we also published a couple of studies looking at reading motivation and how reading motivation can drive engagement with different text types. So this first paper, for example, is looking at the different types of reading experiences that children get from different text types, whether it's books, audio, comics, graphic novels, newspapers, magazines, whatever it might be. And we started to learn about their different motivations for reading different texts. Next slide, please. And in the second article, we looked at reading during adolescence and started to focus in on the different reasons that young people gave for choosing to read or to not read books. And at the end of the Growing Up a Reader project, I spoke with Catherine Wilkinson, who's head of research and evaluation at the Scottish Book Trust. And I said, after doing this Growing Up a Reader project, if you were to do something else, what project would you want to do next? And she said without hesitation, teenage reading, recognizing that this was an area where we really did have to focus on. Next slide. So before I go on to share details of the Young People's Reading Project, which was led by PhD researcher Charlotte Webber, I'm going to talk first of all about what we know. So what does the research say around specific strategies to support teenage reading? Now, this was an article that we published a couple of years ago, which synthesized the previous research, which had evaluated different approaches to support teenage motivation. Now, on reviewing the literature, it was clear that the nature of approaches used varied considerably, and so we used narrative review principles to group them into 5 distinctly different types, and you can see those listed here. Across these different approaches and the different types of programs, strategies, and interventions, we found the quality of research and evidence to be very variable. And there certainly isn't one specific approach that I can say is going to be the solution to teenage reading. While I don't have time to share all of the findings now, there is a link to this at the end of the talk today, so you can access this paper if you're interested in reading it in more detail. But in addition to reviewing the literature, we also aim to identify gaps in knowledge and provide suggestions for future research. And what we found was a lack of reading motivation approaches which had centred teenagers' perspectives, opinions, or contributions. Indeed, approaches to increase reading motivation were almost entirely adult-led or adult-developed. And so with that, we argue that future approaches to support teenagers' reading motivation should be co-created with teenagers, centering their voices and their ideas. Next slide, please. So this led to the Young People's Reading Project, a 3.5-year project which ran from 2020 to 2024, carried out in collaboration with the Scottish Book Trust, and a group of 6 teenagers who had input into the design and implementation of the research and also the interpretation of the research findings. The study also involved in-depth interviews with a large group of teenagers, 46 in total, who had a wide range of different types of reading interests, experiences, motivations, to gain their insights into the motivators and barriers to book reading. As I said, the entire project was led by PhD researcher Charlotte Webber, and we've written it up in two different research articles. So there's one article which looks at teenagers' perspectives on the motivators to reading, and another which looks at teenagers' perspectives on the barriers to reading. But for the purposes of the talk today, I'm going to integrate these together and share some of our key insights. So next slide, please. So over the next few slides, I'm going to focus on these 7 themes in detail. I'm going to start by providing a quote from a young person, and I'll give you time to read that yourself. It'll be in italics. And then I'll be clear about whether this theme was identified in our data as a motivator, a barrier, or both. And then reflect on what this may mean in terms of implications for practice. I'm aware there's a lot of sort of expert professionals, either teachers or librarians with us today as well. And if you have any other suggestions based on these themes for practice, I'd really welcome discussion of these at the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'll let you read the italics and the quotes first, and then I'll talk about the principle. And it was seen as access was seen as a barrier where they found it hard to physically access the types of books that they wanted at home or at school, but was a motivator where they had access to reading material which was readily available to them and regular opportunities to access it. So the theme of access is really about teenagers having access to quality books which reflect their personal interests, preferences, and goals for reading, in addition to books which reflect their lives, their identities, but also their reading skills and their reading stamina. In other words, it's about access to personally enjoyable, meaningful, and accessible texts. But importantly, as you've seen, it's not just about access to these, but also having sufficient time and opportunity to access the provision. For example, some of the teenagers we spoke to spoke about having a great school library, just never being given the time to use it. Each of these themes is written up in a lot more detail in a report that I'll share with you at the end. But in terms of what this means for practice, we would encourage you to update school library provision, seeking young people's input into that and supporting with the curation. Regular visits to the school, but also local library as well to increase access. Making it easier for young people to find books aligned with their personal interests and preferences, whether that's how books are displayed or structured within a school library, and allowing and encouraging the use of technology to increase access to quality books as well. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll just let you read the quotes first. Okay, so this was seen as a barrier where young people didn't feel that they had the skills or the confidence to choose books which are relevant to their interests or lives, and then as a motivator where they did feel confident choosing books and knew how to access these. So the theme of choice really focuses on supporting teenagers' skills to choose books or other texts which are personally enjoyable, meaningful, and accessible to them. Indeed, in secondary school, teenagers are typically taught, for example, reading comprehension skills, but very rarely are they explicitly taught how to choose books to support their personal reading practices. So, in terms of what this means for practice, expanding teenagers' understanding of different book or text genres, giving them explicit guidance on how to choose books, or making it easier for them to find books based on how they're structured or using an app, can really help too. And later on in this session, you're going to hear from Heather at the Scottish Book Trust, who'll be talking about a resource created by Scottish Book Trust, Story Deck, which was developed from this project, which really sought to support teenagers' understanding of the different types of experiences, I guess, that books can offer, and for them to start to kind of narrow in and think about what they were interested in and what their preferences are as well. And next slide, please. So this was seen as a motivator to book reading where young people felt that they had a sense of control over when, where, what, why, and how they read. Indeed, the teenage years are periods of life commonly associated with an increased desire and need for autonomy, and this needs to reflect how we support teenage reading. In terms of what this means for practice, we need to encourage reading routines that fit into and are seen by young people to enrich their lives. We need to help them and empower them with the skills to find books or texts which connect with their personal interests and goals so that they choose to read of their own volition. And we also need to encourage their input into book provision, class reads, reading activities, understanding their needs and preferences and enabling reading which aligns with these. And next slide, please. Okay, I'll just let you read the quote first. So reading was seen as a barrier when it didn't fit into young people's social lives, or social factors could be a motivator where they felt they had supportive relationships which facilitated reading in personally enjoyable and meaningful ways. And as you can see, that sort of illustrated with the quote here. So in terms of what this means for practice, we would suggest that if organising book clubs, these should be led by young people, centering the text that they want to read and share. In addition, recognising the value of online reading communities to support, for example, with book recommendations or sharing of texts. We found that for a minority of young people, seeing others read, in other words, reading role models, could perhaps support their own motivation to read. But they very rarely spoke about teachers or parents as being role models, but rather it was inspirational others. So they referred to sports people or other famous people. Okay, next slide, please. So this theme is actually a really complex theme because it's got lots of different components to it. But I think you can kind of summarize it by thinking about developing a whole school reading culture. So this was seen as a barrier where young people felt that there was a mismatch between what they want to read, the ways that they want to read, and how reading, was taught and supported in school. And it was seen as a motivator where they had encouragement from teachers, had quality books in comfortable spaces and time to read, and also had support for their reading skills. So this theme is really about creating environments within school which are conducive to positive reading experiences. And in terms of implications for practice, it means creating a teaching environment that values and supports reading enjoyment within the classroom alongside supporting reading skills. It's also important to recognise that some core and compulsory books and texts used within the secondary classroom may put some teenagers off reading. And so we need to ensure that there's sufficient time and support given to nurturing personally enjoyable reading habits alongside these compulsory texts. Finally, creating comfortable and welcoming spaces to read in school and time to read for enjoyment may also support with engagement. Next slide, please. So this next theme is about time and competing priorities. I'll let you read the quote first. So it doesn't say anything good about reading, but I'll let you read the quote anyway. So in terms of a barrier, young people reported feeling that they had less free time to read for pleasure than when they were younger and or prioritised other activities in their free time. So young people spoke about increased demands in terms of their schoolwork, wanting to spend more time with friends, or simply wanting to do other things. In fact, reading wasn't often a priority for a lot of the young people that we spoke to, as you can see from this quote. And it was also seen by some to be quite a lot of effort. So in terms of implications for practice, providing time within the school day to read for pleasure may help, but with books or texts aligned with reading interests, reading skills, and also reading stamina. Beyond this, supporting other types of text engagement, whether it's online or audio, may help to support reading to fit more easily within teenagers' everyday lives. Indeed, behaviour change is hard, and so we need to find ways to integrate reading into the lives of the everyday teenager. Next slide, please. I'll let you read the quote first. So the final concept is that of relatable messaging. Some teenagers mentioned that the way that we, that is adults, speak about reading, the benefits we talk about from reading, or how we promote reading, does not align with their own goals for reading, or their own ways of speaking or communicating. We therefore need to promote reading in ways which are personally meaningful to young people, through authentic and relatable messaging that connects with their ways of thinking, of being, and of communicating. In terms of implications for practice, involving young people in reading promotion messaging could help, as well as linking reading to young people's personal goals rather than adult-defined goals. I personally would encourage the use of the term reading for pleasure when speaking to teenagers. I've never once met a teenager who say they read for pleasure. In fact, this term is completely disconnected with how they talk about reading or personal goals for reading. If we want to increase teenagers' reading enjoyment and engagement, we need to centre young people. We need to understand their motives, their interests, their goals, their lives, their identities, their ways of communicating, and we need to work with them to enhance their enjoyment, their motivation, and their engagement. Next slide, please. So these are the two research articles that I referred to at the beginning, one on barriers to reading, the other one on motivators to reading. You will see familiar themes within them, but obviously I've sort of pulled them together for the purposes of today's talk. And next slide, please. We've also created a guide for secondary teachers and librarians, which again, you'll have access to these web links as well. And this really summarises what we've shared today, some of the kind of key ideas that came up, but also some of the implications for practice. And a lot of these implications for practice, we have teachers and librarians to thank for supporting with that. And Charlotte's also written a number of different blog posts as well to communicate these findings in kind of shorter and more accessible ways. Next slide. So I'm going to pass over in a second to Heather, but I'd just like to thank you all for listening. Thank you to our collaborative partners, Scottish Book Trust, and to all of the young people, the teachers and librarians who were such an integral part of this research. Myself and Charlotte will actually be speaking again next month, looking at representation within fiction, so hopefully some of you will be able to join us for that. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Heather, who will be talking about Story Deck.
Thank you, Sarah. So Becky is going to do my slides as well, since I was presentationally challenged. Let's call it that. Okay, if you move it on, Becky, to the next one. So my name is Heather, and as Sarah said, I work at Scottish Book Trust. I'm a member of the programme team there, specifically looking at ways to engage children and teenagers in reading for pleasure. And it was my immense good fortune to find that I had Charlotte in the office when she was doing her research project, and was able to sort of tap into what she was discovering as she was going through that. She'd just come out of that first research year where she'd spoken to the 46 teenagers in different local authorities across the country. I, at the same time, had been given some funds from our Reading Schools accreditation programme to explore new ways to support teen engagement with reading for pleasure, because, like Charlotte and Sarah, we were aware that there is a decline in an interest in reading, and we wanted to move away from some of the other interventions we delivered previously and look with fresh eyes on ways to make a difference. So Charlotte at the time was working with us on the joint research project, and I asked Charlotte what recurring themes were coming up in her research. One of them that stood out to me the most was that they were reporting not having the language that they needed to describe the stories they were interested in finding. So even with access to adults willing to help them, a great library, friends who read even, they weren't able to, they were struggling to find the right book for them because they couldn't articulate what it was that they like about the stories they've already enjoyed, whether that be in books or even through films and games and TV. So what we were hearing, what Charlotte was hearing, was that this was an issue of language, of critical thinking, of communication and self-reflection. So next slide, Becky. So we quickly settled on the idea that if the young people didn't have words, they might still be able to engage with image. So we knew that what we needed were a set of images that could prompt reflection on stories to act as a catalyst for conversation. And we were aware that sectors such as therapy and counselling often use card decks of images to tease out difficult to articulate feelings. Tarot, for any witches amongst you, is a form of self-reflection where each individual reads different meaning into the same set of images to realise some form of personal enlightenment. So all of these thoughts were swirling around, and we thought, could we make a tarot deck, essentially, that helped a learner understand their own preferences and share that with a professional who could then match them with a book? Next slide. So working in multiple high schools, we set about exploring whether teenagers would naturally respond to images. And we devised a range of activities, including asking pupils to create cards of their own that represented a film, a programme, video game, or a book that they'd really enjoyed, and then sharing those with the group. So we also took photographs as well as illustration with us to explore whether one or the other was more effective. And in the photograph that you can see there, in the centre is a picture of a forest, which was drawn by a pupil in one of our workshops that we held at Craig Royston Community High School here in Edinburgh. She had drawn it to represent the feeling of being lost and isolated in a horror story that she'd enjoyed. During the discussion, when we were all sharing together, one of her classmates said that to them it looked like a beautiful, peaceful place to connect with nature. And that prompted someone else to say that it had made them think about climate catastrophe and deforestation and the damage that we were doing to our planet. And we were having this really rich conversation about the forest. So without prompting, the students were often doing exactly what we hoped they would do. They were each reading into one single image, a vast range of different things. And from then on, the forest became our touchstone of the project and was the first card on our image list when we produced our prototype card deck. Okay, so next slide. So, using what we'd seen during our initial workshops, we devised a list of images to cover as a wide a range as possible of stories that teenagers had told us they engaged with. So we were thinking about narrative features, genres, characters, the feelings generated by engaging with storytelling. And the rule that we set for ourselves was that every single image in the deck had to have at least 2, but preferably more, possible interpretations, just like the forest. It had to earn its place in the deck and be ready to mean a huge range of different things to different teenagers, depending on who it was that was looking at it. So having established with the testers early on that illustration was more timeless and neutral than photography, we used Vecteezy to source images, illustrated images, that we could then tweak and manipulate to our needs. And we produced a prototype card deck that went back out to schools with instructions on how to run a testing session for us. So we left the prototype with our schools for about 2 months, and we had learners and teachers both complete feedback surveys after having an extended period of time just to play with it freely and also use some of our suggestions. So when we got our surveys back in, we found that 95% of the product testers agreed that they enjoyed using StoryDeck. So that was good news. 75% of the product testers agreed that the cards had helped them talk to other people about stories. So conversations were flowing, and that had been our primary aim. 91% said that it was clear to them how to use the cards, and 83% that said that during the using of the cards, a book, a film, a TV show, or a web series or game had been recommended within their group because of the conversations that had been stimulated by playing with StoryDeck and using the activities. So the feedback confirmed to us that we'd made a really strong and useful product, and we used the pupil feedback on the specific images in the prototype to swap some of them out and tweak them and improve them. So for example, they told us that we were missing a monster card. We didn't have enough horror representation. They wanted more animals. They wanted more people. We had initially avoided too many people, worrying that they weren't flexible enough in their interpretations. But across the board, the teens said they wanted to see more characters represented. They didn't like the colours of some of them, and all of this information we took and we tweaked it to make a final deck. Okay, so next slide. Whilst we were producing the finished resource, we also made resources available to everyone that we were going to send it to. So we knew we couldn't just send StoryDeck out to schools cold and expect everybody to understand what it was that we'd hoped to achieve with it. So my colleague Catherine, who's our resource developer, came up with a beautiful range of different resources, and this is just screenshots to show you some of them. So we have a webinar on how to use it. So a pre-recorded webinar where Catherine walks everyone through the purpose of StoryDeck and how we hope it can make a difference in the high schools it's gone to. We also have a couple of downloadable activity packs, one for using StoryDeck in the school or library, either with one pupil or groups of pupils. And we've also got a second activity pack that's about using StoryDeck to inspire creative writing, because through our testing of the prototype, we started to see young people and their teachers and librarians suggesting that that would be an interesting way to use it. They were already just naturally forming their own narratives with the cards that they were spreading out. So we're like, oh, there's a creative writing component to this that we hadn't initially expected. So that goes right from using prompts for short free writing sessions, and then right into using it to structure plots and edit writing. So it's a completely separate resource for people that want to use it in that way. We also have a downloadable PowerPoint that you can use to introduce Story Deck to the pupils, or with a wider staff team. And in that, we give some examples of books and films and games, and some of the different cards that you might use to summarize those texts to help show the young people kind of how you can use the cards to talk about the narratives that you've enjoyed. And there's also a PDF you can see there of all the cards in miniature that we call our sort of key. And that's really just so that there's a way that young people can record their own selections. We realize it might be useful if you were busy playing with Story Deck with your friends and classmates, that you might want to record the ones that you'd selected that really spoke to you. So you had a record of that when you're working with your librarian to be matched up with a story. So those are all freely available on the Reading School's website. Okay, next slide. So just to unpack some of the activities a little bit, I thought I'd give you some examples of the things that are included in the first activity pack. So the first bit is an icebreaker, sort of introducing ideas where pupils share their initial reactions to each card, and we call this hot or cold. So we ask the pupils to not overthink it too much initially, and split the cards into ones that they're drawn to and ones that they're absolutely not. And this is about having a moment of self-reflection about your own personal preferences. And on the back of that, can start to interrogate how what you have chosen is different to one of your classmates. And hopefully, if this is a guided conversation with a learning professional, they're naturally able to start to get to know their young person a little bit better and interrogate slightly what it is that they like about the cards that they've chosen. And steadily through conversation, you just find, I've seen it happen, you just find people naturally, instinctively recommending things to each other. Part of the feedback that we got from librarians was how asking a pupil to pick a book can feel like a high-pressured decision for the young person, especially if they're less engaged with reading or less familiar with visiting the library. So we hope that an activity like this still allows the professional to gain some information that they need from the pupil in order to do that process, but with it feeling slightly more fun, less high stakes, less like an interrogation, perhaps more like play. Okay, that's really what we're trying to get at. And we also have some slightly longer activities. So one of them here, Judge by the Cover, is an idea for asking pupils to interact with books that are already in the school library or in the classroom book corner, whatever selection of books that you have, and making connections between the cards in the deck and the images and the books that they can see, the jackets. So using all the clues available to you on the book jacket, whether it be the image, the blurb on the back, the pull quotes on the front, and then looking through the cards to see if you can find the images that best reflect that. And this is all about trying to develop the skill, like Sarah was mentioning, the skill of finding a book. I think some of us take it for granted and it's tricky to decode those clues. But the games with the cards, we find that the young people respond really well to that, and it's play. And suddenly they're able to do it, and they've got a language through the cards, even if they don't have the words initially themselves, and steadily conversation flows. And they start to do some really beautiful critical thinking, lateral thinking sideways, about what the clues on the book are telling them about the type of story it might be. Okay, so next slide. We started to see, once we were testing the final deck had gone into school libraries, that a lot of the librarians were using it as a visual language across their spaces. So we piloted Story Deck in Forfar Academy in Angus, and they took it beyond our resources and really used the imagery throughout the library. So they created a wall of book recommendations using images from Story Deck. And they also had a sign on the librarian's desk inviting pupils to get a Story Deck prescription. I've seen Emma, the librarian at Forfar, do this just so beautifully. She asks the children to come up and rifle through the deck, just pick 3 cards. It's almost like a magic trick. She'll then take them to the stacks and try to match them up with something based upon the 3 that they've felt most drawn to that particular day. Their S1 pupils reported back that they found this use of Story Deck throughout the library really helpful because it helped them identify where to find different types of book, especially when they were newer to the school. If you've got pupils who are newer or still developing their understanding of genre, you're developing that learning whilst helping them think about the kind of text they might want to find when they get stuck into the stacks. And also it's a nice way to encourage pupil interaction with the library, encouraging the idea that the library is not just somewhere to read on your own, but it also acts as a space to read and connect with others. And so we're using the visual language of Story Deck as a shared language amongst all the library users. So on our website, we've created shelf shouters that schools can print out to recommend books on the stacks, just like Emma had been doing across Forfar Academy Library. And we also have a printable template for pupils to create their own Story Deck cards, because we're aware that there's 52 cards in a Story Deck, and every time I meet a group of teenagers, they tell me that I forgot one crucial image. So what we like to encourage is that schools have the pupils add the cards that we've missed out to their deck and keep them as part of the set that lives at school. Okay, next slide. So Story Deck was gifted in February 2025. It took us a couple of months to get through it all, but 3 packs of Story Deck were gifted to every single high school in Scotland, and also made available to the public libraries who requested sets. So the libraries that had particular teen engagement, we reached out to every local authority and asked them to nominate public libraries that could benefit from having one available. We continue to receive really strong feedback about how useful the deck is in engaging learners in organic conversations about narratives in all mediums, not just reading. And we emphasize that when we're speaking to the teenagers, that we're really just interested in finding out what stories they're interested in. We never begin the conversation with books. Several librarians have told us that they've seen book borrowing increase, and they've gotten to know their learners better because of using Story Deck, and that they're using the deck regularly at bookshelves to do one-to-one recommending. We're currently investigating whether Story Deck can make a difference to primary 7 to S1 transition, and we're working in 4 local authorities across central Scotland. I spent last week in workshops actually in primary 7 classrooms, seeing how differently slightly younger children take to Story Deck. And it's been really interesting because there are definite differences, but also lots of positive experiences so far. We get regular requests from schools asking if they can purchase additional sets, or from schools outside of Scotland asking whether they can purchase just one. And sadly, due to restrictions with our funding, we're not permitted to sell it because it was funded by our Reading Schools programme. It's actually owned by the King, and there is a clause that says I can't sell it commercially to anybody. So I'm sorry about that, because we do keep meeting people that would like to buy one, and my hands are slightly tied there. But we have had discussions about making a commercially available version. It would have to be slightly different, but this would likely take some time and require a different funding source. So I don't have a neat, tidy answer for that at the minute. But the response, we're not blind to the response. We know that there's interest in having it. So we are thinking about that as best we can. So next slide. I thought I might just end on the difference that Story Deck is making. So you can see one of our school librarians that received their sets has said here, I think it's opened up a lot of conversations with pupils. So far, we've used them at book club in a few different ways. First, they picked 3 cards to represent a book, and we had to guess what it is. Then they picked cards that they liked and told a short story about them. We used them as book prescriptions too, which was great. They might not tell me the sorts of things or themes that they're interested in, but when they pick a card, I can see the image they've chosen, and it's much easier to help them pick out a book. I've got some other quotes. Pupils who are a bit reluctant to talk about books can often be encouraged into it by starting off talking about the games or movies that the cards remind them of, and then we can segue into reading. It's nice to use them to talk about their likes and dislikes, the hot and cold game, or about genres too. And someone else said, the more we use them, the more activities we think of to use them for. They've helped me talk in a new way to pupils about books and reading, and opened up loads of different conversations about what they're interested in, and created a general buzz around book talks. So that's the sort of thing we're hearing from the high schools that received Story Deck. And that's really all I was going to share with you, but I'd be happy to take questions if I've not said something that I should have explained about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather and Sarah. That was just fascinating. Thank you. I can see that we've had lots of positive comments in the chat box and lots of requests for please, can we have one? So thank you for working on that. I think that's much appreciated by everybody. Someone did ask a question about whether whether you think it would extend to different ages, both younger and older.
Yeah, so that's what we're doing at the minute, is seeing whether or not, if we were able to put Story Deck into primary 7, so that's year 6 for those of you who are in England, whether it would help transition to high school, specifically with kids getting up to speed with the school library, if they're lucky enough to find they have one. I realise not all of them will. Whether being familiar with Story Deck earlier makes that process better, essentially. But we knew that you can't just dish it out to the primaries and expect those children to take to it like we found the teenagers did necessarily. So that's what we're testing at the moment. I'm back in schools on Thursday doing the same thing. And we are finding it is slightly different. So I did a similar game to Catherine's book cover idea, where I took a selection of middle grade that I sort of thought these are the types of stories that are that 9 plus. So you'll find it in a primary school library, but you'll definitely also find it in a high school library. And I asked them to look at the clues on the books and make a card selection for each one, and let's have a discussion about what we think these stories might be about. And so many of the kids picked slightly odd cards, and it's like, oh, so why did you pick the explosion card for this book that's clearly about mythological unicorns? And they said, oh, well, because it's orange, like the book jacket. I was like, okay, but do we think there's any explosions in this story? You know, is there anything that leads us to think that? And there was a lot of that, a lot of literal thinking rather than properly being able to decode. And that's not saying everyone was like that, but that was something we didn't encounter when we did it with teenagers. That's the first time I've seen that happen. So I think you could make a version for primary school, but I would need the input of experts in primary children, primary teachers, to tell me the ways in which it needed to be different, and probably the ways in which the resources needed to be different. But as soon as we gifted it to all of the high schools, we said to ourselves, the next obvious thing to do is take this process and see whether it could be a primary version could be made. How we would fund the distribution of that is a different matter, because obviously it's so many more schools around the country. But I think there's a very good chance we might do that work fully, and doing this mini transition investigation is sort of our way of dipping our toe in. It's giving us a chance to get into some primary school classrooms and run activities and see how they do it differently. So, yeah,
Thank
we'll
you.
write those findings up in the next couple of months, I suppose.
So watch this space.
Yeah,
Yeah.
watch this space.
Well, thank you so much, Heather and Sarah. We've come to the end of our time together. So thank you ever so much for speaking to us this afternoon. Thank you to everyone who came along. Do join us, as Sarah said, for the next one in this series that we're doing, which will come in March, all to celebrate the National Year of Reading. And for now, I will wish you all a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.